This is the time to describe the user's views. To do so, we need to identify real-life objects. A useful tip is to pay attention to the nouns users mention in their descriptions, such as invoices, clients, products, etc., and then represent them as GeneXus objects. GeneXus developers don't work on low-level tasks such as designing tables, normalizing, programming, and the like. Instead, their work is a higher-level activities that implies describing the reality of users. After that, GeneXus analyzes the defined objects and starts designing the database and creating the application programs for the selected platform in a fully automatic manner. Let's suppose that the pharmacy requesting the application asks to be able to record all the products they have on sale. To describe each real-life object identified, you have to create a GeneXus object of the transaction type. But beware, because this is not related to database transactions. To create a transaction object, select File, New, Object in the toolbar. This is the dialog box for selecting the type of object you want to create. We select Transaction in this case and enter a name for it, which in this case will be Product. By clicking on the Create button, the product transaction is created and kept open, ready for you to start defining its structure. Each transaction has some sections that we'll explain gradually. Specifically, the transaction structure makes it possible to define the attributes or fields that describe a real-life object. Suppose that at a pharmacy you were told that they need to record every product's code, name, sale price, the stock available, and the type of product, such as medicine, cosmetics, etc. This data that must be recorded for each product matches the attributes we will create for this transaction. Note that we press Enter and the first line in the transaction structure is automatically created for you to enter the first attribute. Also, a key icon is associated with this line. The reason for this is that in every transaction, an attribute or set of attributes must be set as a unique identifier or primary key. The purpose of the unique identifier or primary key is to uniquely identify each product or any object of reality. In other words, the app's end user won't be able to enter two products with the same identifier value. Clearly, the primary key of the product transaction will be the product code, so let's define it. By pressing the period key on the keyboard, GeneXus will automatically show the transaction name as a prefix in the attribute name. You only have to type code after the product prefix. Then, by pressing the Tab key, you can choose the data type to be stored for this attribute. The default data type is numeric of 4 digits with no decimals. However, the pharmacy requested that the product code always be a numeric value of up to 10 digits, so you have to change its length to 10. By pressing Enter, a new line is opened where you can start defining the second attribute. Again, you have to type the period key on the keyboard and complete the attribute name with name, that is, product name. It will be of character type with a length of 50. Now you must add the product price attribute of numeric type with 9 digits and 2 decimals. As you will probably need to create more attributes to define prices or amounts, that is, when the pharmacy buys or sells products, it might be a good idea to create a generic definition type for all prices. To do this, in the type column, you just have to write price equal before the type you have selected. Then press Enter, and you'll see that the product price attribute has been set as a price type. That is, price. The definition of price with numeric type of 9 digits with 2 decimals is called domain. Domains allow making generic definitions. One of their advantages is that if later on you need prices to be numeric of a graded length, you'll only have to change the domain definition and all the attributes based on that domain will be updated in a single step. To view the domains created in the knowledge base, select View, Domains in the toolbar. As you can see, GeneXus automatically creates some domains. When you click on a given domain, the Properties window is refreshed with its properties. Note that in addition to setting the data type for a domain, you can also define other interesting properties for it. The properties window will be refreshed every time you select another attribute, domain, object, etc., with the corresponding properties available for configuration in each case. If the properties panel is not visible, you can press F4 to open it. Let's go back to the product transaction, where the next attribute you have to define is product stock of numeric type and length 4. Now it's necessary to record the product type. You could create an attribute called product type as character of 50. But what happens if users want to add two products of the same type? They'll have to enter the same type name twice, being very careful to type it exactly the same. Later on, they might need to search for all the products of the same type, and to get them, the types must have been written in the same way. It seems more reasonable to enter the type of product only once in a single location and then assign the corresponding product type to each product. So, let's delete the product type attribute from the structure and save the product transaction as shown. For each transaction, GeneXus automatically designs a web or web layout interface based on the defined structure. This web interface will enable the app's users to add, update, and delete products at runtime. Now let's create another transaction to record the product types. We can press Ctrl+N to open the new object selection panel. We'll choose the transaction and it will be called product type. We have to record the code and name for each product type. So we create the attributes: product type code, that will be a numeric 4, and product type name, a character of 50. Naming attributes with a transaction name as a prefix not only makes defining attributes easier and faster, it is also GeneXus community convention to easily understand an attribute name wherever it may be, and to know which object it is describing. Look at the properties of the product type code attribute. The autonumber property is set to false by default. By changing it to true, all the new product types entered by the end user will be automatically numbered in sequence. So, let's set the autonumber property to true for this identifier attribute and save the product type transaction. As I explained before, each transaction has a web interface automatically designed by GeneXus according to its structure. Below is the product type web interface. Now assign a product type to each product. To do so, go back to the product transaction, add a new line to its structure, and type the letter P. The list of attributes existing in the knowledge base that begin with that letter will be displayed. By selecting product type code, its entire definition is displayed. In this transaction, we also need to include the product type name attribute. The product type name attribute, because when users execute this transaction and select a product type code, they'll want to see the corresponding product type name. Let's focus on these two attributes included in more than one transaction. Product type code is the identifier attribute in the product type transaction. More specifically, it is the primary key of that transaction. So, when a primary key is included in another transaction, GeneXus understands that there the attribute has the role of a foreign key. Including an attribute that is a transaction primary key in another transaction allows you to both relate both transactions. GeneXus establishes relationship through attribute names in each transaction, so when it finds attributes with the same name in different transactions, it assumes that they refer to the same concept. The product type name attribute is also present in both transactions. However, it isn't marked as the identifier of any of the defined transactions. Therefore, GeneXus will take it as a secondary attribute. It will then include product type name in the product type physical table that we'll create in the database and not in the product physical table. The concept of transaction and physical table are not the same. Remember that transaction is the GeneXus objects that you create in the knowledge base to represent an object of reality. Upon considering InstruStructure and the rest of the transaction structures defined in the knowledge base and taking into account some properties, GeneXus will determine the physical tables that it will create in the database, as well as the attributes that belong to those tables. At runtime, when running the web interface of a product transaction, the user must enter for the product type code attribute a value that already exists in the product type table, because product type code is a foreign key in the product transaction. Otherwise, an error will be displayed. If we enter the product type code correctly, the value of product type name will be obtained automatically.